Midnight, the boy rolls the modern is the man of mesh. With the seal never found from the hour of the weeks at the beacon on the right Paris. Yeah, I see the face, we came back, but it was. I get colors, we should be there, sniff, with these men.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. We don't have taglines on this podcast.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. No, really, we don't have taglines on this podcast.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. We gotta tell the guys at work about this one.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Being Mr. Boop. Electropoint.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Pac-Man is in the eye of the beholder.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Everything's coming up Millhouse.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, originally a dog. Originally a dog. Sorry.
Thank you. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Now a Funko Pop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. You know they fucking.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. You guys hear about this?
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. That face when you're Mr. Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Starring Rowan Atkinson.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Unless you already turned it off, but then you wouldn't hear this tagline anyway.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. When the boop hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that's divorcee.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Huh?
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Da 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 da. It's the one and only B-O-P. Boop dog.
You're not... You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. What do you get when you cross a podcast with a webcomic? You get webcomics reviews and interviews, a webcomic podcast devoted to the creation and monetization of webcomics. Anyway, here's Being Mr. Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Now being sued by no less than 3 separate parties.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Podcast end now!
Imagine.
Could you imagine?
If we ended right here.
Here's part 2.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Wouldn't it be nice if we were married to Ferdy's cartoon heartthrob Betty Boop?
You added the so it would flow better, and you didn't even read it.
Didn't I know?
You didn't read the.
Oh.
No, it was
Well,
good though.
flows
I think
just
it
fine.
flows. I think it flows better without the, but you insisted. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. This is the tagline.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. This is another tagline.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Betty Boop out of context.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Ay caramba.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Straight out of the inkwell.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Coming up next, Being Mrs. Popeye.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. 100% sandwich free.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Now in color.
Color. Now in color. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Licensed to wed.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. This guy's married to Betty Boop. Epic.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop from the people who brought you Cartoon All-Stars to the rescue.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Please see our slang guide for more info.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Come on down and get yourself a used expression chair, only $2.99. We're practically giving these recurring comic strip elements away.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. There was a little Mr. Boop, a comic
Oh, come
star.
on. No, it's Little Spanish Flea. It's Little Spanish
I know it's Spanish. Flea.
Do
I
Little
think
Spanish
it's
Flea.
pretty-
Do it.
There was a You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. There was a little Mr. Boop, a comic star. He thought he'd oop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Being Betty Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Oh, jeez.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, featuring original character Bostonian Frankenstein, which Lisa thought was a Being Team Davis
A
character.
Being Davis character. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. 100% human meat free.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, now 90% Dirty Blues talk.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. You can call me Mr. Boop.
Good enough. You're listening to You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, or as we say here in the UK, Being Mr. Boop. Should I do that with an accent?
That's for you to decide.
That's for you to decide, listeners.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Doops on boops.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Oops, all boops.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. One of the host's names rhymes.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I doop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Come on and sloop. And welcome to the Boop.
Why are you so hesitant?
Because I've kind of committed to the style I'm saying this.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. We gotta tell the guys at work to come up with more taglines.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. This guy's Mr. Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. One this about work at guys that tell gotta we.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. You're still here?
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Season 2.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I hate podcasting, I hate podcasting, I hate podcasting, I hate podcasting.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop.
Oh! You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. He made another one.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. What'd you get with a boop in your soup?
Gotta get that soup. Oh my god, I can't believe we fucking predicted gotta get that soup. What the fuck?
Maybe that's what he was dreaming about. What inspired the dream.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Not sponsored by Pretzilla Soft Baked Pretzel Bites.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. You're listening to it.
You want to take that one again?
No, that's good. That was fine.
Oh boy. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, with the man and the wife in the top left panel with the bottom right panel to Getty.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Arms Akira.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, Arms Amoebra.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. What do you get when you cross a podcast with a webcomic? You get Tales of Rude Stuff, the D&D podcast starring famous webcomic artists Branson Reese and Chris Hastings. Anyway, here's Being Mr. Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. What do you get when you cross a podcast with a webcomic? You get Jason Loves Life, the podcast that helps your webcomic live long and prosper. Anyway, here's Being Mr. Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. What do you get when you cross a podcast with a webcomic? You get Screen Tones, a podcast about all things webcomic, by a group of webcomic creators. Anyway, here's Being Mr. Boop.
I feel like there's at least one of those we had not read before.
Probably.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. No more boops. That's true.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I hate being Mr. Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. No, you're not.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I don't know which boop to shoot.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Ryan is here. The idea of me reading this one.
Yeah.
You're listening to You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Ryan is here in spirit.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I do.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. What do you get when you cross a podcast with a webcomic? You get what you fucking deserve.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, a loving tribute to a niche internet series. No, not that one. The other one.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Why?
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, our punishment for shooting Alec Robbins.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. You construct intricate rituals which allow you to voice cool other people.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Urge to quit daily recap podcast. Rising.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Imagine if a good podcast talked about Mr. Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Well, we're still on 211 consecutive days, and all because of one little sense of commitment that won't let me stop.
Alright.
Yeah.
Sure.
That was like a you're in a small theater and it's a dramatic performance type thing. Like, oh, you can't be too loud.
Not quite. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. What Mr. Boop opinions have y'all like this?
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I must boop what I must boop. It's a Devo.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Boopy boops.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Season 3.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I have no boops, and I must scream.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Season 3.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Gah?
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. No boops here.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Well, you doesn't have to call me Mr. Boop. My name is Alec Robbins Boop. Now you can call me Alec, or you can call me Boop, or you can call me Boopy, or you can call me Robbie, or you can call me Al, or you can call me AB, or you can call me AR, or you can call me ARB, or you can call me Mr. But you doesn't have to call me Mr. Boop.
Nice.
Yeah, see?
Yeah.
I've heard you do it.
Nah,
I've heard you.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Coincidentally, Hitler is alive in this universe.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Why don't you recap Mr. Boop for a change?
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. This one's funny.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. It's on like Donkey Kong, so let's go like Don Pardo.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Everything is terrible, my wife left me, and she took the fucking kids.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Soon to be a Charles Dickens podcast.
Remains to be seen. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Whoa, boop be upon ye.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. The only podcast called Being Mr. Boop going on this RSS feed.
Going up on this RSS feed.
I think I did a bit of editorializing. I think it's...
Editorializing, what? You editorialized the word editorializing. Fuck it, it's just... You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. 90% my wife jokes.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Hashtag fun.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Guys at work, we gotta tell thee.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Betty Boop is fun.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Evidence that you don't have to have different political views to have vastly different worldviews.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I'm like Walter White, except I record a daily recap podcast.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, your least favorite podcast released on this day of the week.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. More so about itself than Mr. Boop.
It's true. Did we ever read that one? That's
I don't
true.
know.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Breaking Bad voice. Co-host, we need the podcast.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Obnoxious in concept and theory. Wait a second, that's the same thing twice.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Guys at work, we must tell.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I'm the Jonathan, and you're the Chris.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I'm the Chris, and you're the Jonathan.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. For when today's Being Jim Davis episode hasn't been posted yet.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. None of it is real! It's all fake! The reality you thought you knew has all been an elaborate ruse orchestrated by one man and one man alone! Wake up, people! You're sheep! You're all sheep!
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Being Mr. Boop. Have you?
Question mark? Have you?
I don't know what that is.
Hang on a second. Inspect element. It was you.
I don't remember. I don't know what it means.
Oh, you didn't credit anything, so I wrote the question mark. Maybe you didn't finish writing that one.
I probably didn't, judging by the content.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Listeners, get them.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Ooh, that's good podcasting.
Yes, good. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, an inside scoop into Mr. Boop. Oh my god, no.
You're listening.
No. No.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Where am I?
Oh god. Are you mad? If we were still writing taglines, there'd just be a tagline for every single fucking thing.
I'm English.
I'm English. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. He shagged her. He shagged a Roten, baby, yeah.
Who?
Mr. Boop.
I like that bit is not a reference to the soundboard or to the movie Lost House, but to that specific exchange. Okay.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I'm Mr. Boop. Who the hell are you?
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. For some reason.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, whether you like it or not.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Hey, Boop Boy, you killed my mother.
What's that a reference to?
That's a Ween song.
I
Hey,
knew
Fat
it.
Boy.
I don't know. I guessed it right before you said it.
We talked about this. We've
That's-
talked about this.
No, I guessed it.
Okay.
I guessed it.
And also, you've heard the song. Just because you've heard the Ween album.
Shut up. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Hey baby, this party's booping.
You're
That's a
listening
Game
to
Grumps
Being Mr.
reference.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Just shifted to the universe Mr. Boop takes place in. That place is not okay.
Just shifted to the universe Being Mr. Boop takes place in.
Yeah,
That
wow.
place is not okay.
Hear about that Twitter buyout? Whoa.
I thought you were saying Twitter bio.
What a bio. What a bio.
What a bio. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. One of them's a genius, and the other one's insane.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. While neither host supports the other's career aspirations.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I hate hard water stains. I mean podcasting.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I was Mr. Boop in a previous life. Is what I will say at some point in the future, I'm sure.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. One of them's a genius, and the other one's a boop. You see, I wrote this one during episode 196 because we go the one of them's a genius and the other one's insane tagline, and I was disappointed to find out I didn't even put a boop reference in it. So I added this one, which is essentially the same, except I put the other one's a boop at the end instead of the other one's insane. This one is also bad. It also just occurred to me that people may not understand that it's a reference to the theme song to Pinky and the Brain, which it is.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, where we're high on wife.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Analyze that.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Britney Spears!
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Proud supporters of Land of the Lost, 2009.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. More funny than you'd think, but less funny than you'd hope.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Practice for either of our real podcasts.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. The snack that smiles back.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. 2.5 Men Stinger voice. Boop.
I'm
Did I
obsessed
say-
with the
Did I say
I've never
Did I say 2.5 Men? Because that's how it's.
I
Whatever.
I've only ever seen 2.5 Men on television in the background. I've never sat down and watched one, but I, for some reason, am obsessed with that stinger. Men. Like, I always think about it. It's like fun.
Men.
Yeah. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Fuck it. We're doing it live.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. If you come across Ryan, don't believe his lion.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. It's even worse.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. More on that later.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. If you think this is good, you should hear our podcast. It's worse!
What?
I never understood this.
I think it's supposed to be a more nonsensical version of the... You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, in no way affiliated with any remakes of Reservoir Dogs.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Further evidence that Chris and Jonathan make it look easy.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop, the spin-off podcast that won't go away. Until now.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Surprisingly absent from Being Jim Davis's Associated Acts Infobox bar.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Betty on the left, Alec on the right. Here I am describing the webcoming Mr. Boop with you.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. I distinctly remember it being a cold night when the Boop boys and Lisa entered my office. I'd just finished up with a case involving a cat in an intentional stance, and was particularly bummed out that it didn't go as I planned. Sure, everyone knew the BB&L around Pitstop Alley, but we didn't like him. When Mr. Boop croaked it on New Year's Day and the Davis fellows showed signs of slowing down, they showed up more than willing to fulfill both of their seats, quickly rising the ranks of the Boop gang as well as the Davis crew. They'd actually been quite close with the Davis guys before they stabbed them in the back. Sure, it's friendly faces for newspapers now, but you can tell it's fake. Just the same way you can tell those Davis creeps are being kept alive by some devil's promise to podcast forever. Heh, didn't you guys used to be Dean Davis? I say to them. They just give me a smirk. Next things I know, I've 2 Betty Boop-shaped bullets in my chest. I woke up 2 hours later in a hospital. No one ever saw him after that, and I never told a soul what happened to me, or that I was the last to see the Boop boys and Lisa. Wherever they are now, I hope it's nice.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. When you notice that your bros are describing Mr. Boop, you're in a boop.
That's pretty good. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. When you notice that your wife is a smoking hot babe, you're Mr. Boop. You're Mr. Boop. When the striplet is dissected and you are resurrected, you're Mr. Boop. You're Mr. Boop. When copy strikes attack and your wife is a snack, you're Mr. Boop.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Look upon my boops, ye mighty, and despair. Tagline author Doopy Mandius.
Yeah. Whoever that guy is. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Underappreciated in its time?
Underappreciated in its time?
Does he know?
Does he know? You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. A total of 10 listeners.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Every other episode is about Westworld.
You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. She's my cartoon wife. Put a grin on your wife face 10 miles wide. Looks so good, lead to bunny homicide. Sweet cartoon wife. It's pretty good, right?
You're listening to Being
Pretty
Mr.
good, right?
Boop.
Come on.
Yeah, it was alright. You're listening
it's
to
all
Being
right.
Mr. It's alright. You're listening to Being Mr. Boop. Our only sin was thinking people would listen to a daily podcast.
This podcast was brought to you by the Pitch Drop Podcast Network. Like what you just heard? Support the show by going to patreon.com/pitchdrop. And while you're at it, check out pitchdrop.net for more of this and other shows.